Welcome. My name is Michael Duncan, and I'm the Director of Applied Research at the Institute for Advanced Learning and Research. Our program today is Insights in Industries for STEM-related Careers. It's part of CSIP, the Commonwealth STEM Industry Internship Program, and it's a collaboration between the Virginia Space Grant Consortium, the Institute for Advanced Learning and Research, and others. Our goal is to provide information to Virginia's college students who are pursuing degrees in science, technology, engineering, and math. It is our hope that after you finish your studies, that you'll explore opportunities to work in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Today we will be talking about the role that social media plays in the career development process and the impression that social media can create before students even apply for a job. Our guest today is ClaireJacobs, Internship Coordinator at the Christopher Newport University Center for Career Planning. Claire has a PhD in Communication Studies and more than 25 years of experience in counseling and advising students, employees, and employers in communication skills, written, verbal, and interpersonal. Claire, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My first question relates to your role in that position at Christopher Newport, as I'm sure you offer advice to students all the time on how to prepare for interviews and job opportunities. The question's pretty simple. Does social media play a role in any kind in this exercise? And should students even be concerned about their social media presence?
Well, the answer is simple, and the answer is yes. It matters. Social media matters a lot right now, more than it ever has, and I think it only will continue to matter for students. So I think it's important as students make the transition from high school into college. The beginning process is deciding, what does your digital footprint look like right now? Are you happy about that? Would a potential employer be happy about that? And one of the ways to figure that out is to actually Google yourself. Sounds like kind of an odd thing to do, but it will quickly tell you what images for your name are coming up. And then as students get a little further along in their college career, they can begin to think about social media as an actual tool to use to get to know employers, to have employers know them, to connect with alumni from their colleges and universities. So social media matters a lot.
Well, this is a little off script, but what you've said intrigues me because being a little bit older, I'm used to the resume being the key point of introduction, but it sounds to me as if the resume and that digital footprint you speak of are both pretty important.
I would say the digital presence that a student has is at least as important as the resume. And in the case of, for example, LinkedIn, it is really a virtual resume. Your LinkedIn profile page can very easily represent your resume in a virtual manner, in addition to actually uploading your resume to your LinkedIn profile. So the LinkedIn profile, the resume can very much go hand in hand.
Well, what about photographs? I mean, in this country, we don't typically put photographs on CVs or resumes, but that happens overseas a lot. But I assume that a student would want a nice professional headshot or something out there on that LinkedIn page or other photos that might come up.
Absolutely. The recommendation with LinkedIn is that you do have a professional headshot, and meaning, kind of from the neck up, and it should be in a coat and tie or a suit. Simple backdrop. It's interesting how you'll see pictures, and not just students, but people with their heads tilted, with their arms around people. And the recommendation is that it be just a simple headshot, not a selfie, because you can tell when somebody's doing that. And it's interesting because that does raise some questions regarding one's gender, one's ethnicity, and those kinds of things are obviously able to be seen on a LinkedIn profile, but the recommendation is to have a picture. It's considered a little odd if there's not a picture.
Oh, okay. Well, how odd would it be not to have a LinkedIn page then?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think many employers, I mean, the statistics I'm seeing are as high as 75% of employers do an initial pass on LinkedIn to do some initial recruiting, and then as many as half of those employers may make decisions to hire someone based on what they're seeing in social media.
Well, that begs a really serious question then, because a lot of people put stuff on social media that they might consider to be private or just to be shared with friends. But if an employer is going to do a background investigation of some kind, even if it's just on the web, that might not be the kind of thing a young person wants out there.
Well, and that does raise some interesting questions regarding privacy. And there's been some discussion about the legality of employers asking prospective employees for their password, for example, for Facebook. LinkedIn is an obviously public profile.
Okay.
Facebook, we have passwords, we have privacy settings. At the very least, a student ought to be sure that their Facebook settings are set to private so that any photographs are visible only to your friends on Facebook. Understand, however, that an employer could say, Michael, may I have your password to look at your Facebook page? And then you have an interesting moment there to decide how you will answer that. And you might want to say, well, I take privacy very seriously, and the Facebook policy is to not share your password with anyone. And I would take your organization's privacy policies as seriously, and so I'm going to respectfully decline sharing my password with you. And that's a legitimate thing for a student to say to an employer.
But I imagine it would be difficult to say in the moment.
It might be,
Yeah.
which makes it worthwhile practicing, which that would be my advice to any student going into an interview, is to practice some of your answers and to think through how you'd like to respond to that. Because it doesn't necessarily mean that because I don't want to share my password with you that I have things to hide.
Right.
And in fact, you could say, can we log on together? And maybe I'll show you my Facebook page. But it is well worth a student, as you're coming out of high school, moving into college, thinking about how you would like to be viewed by the world.
Well, speaking of the world, we've talked about LinkedIn, but what about some of the others? There's Google Plus and Twitter and those kinds of things. Is that a good thing for prospective applicants to get involved with?
Absolutely. What I've started to see with Twitter, and I've just now started to get familiar with Twitter, and our Center for Career Planning does have a Twitter account, is that it is a great way to engage with prospective employers. It's an interesting way to hear from influencers in the field. For example, my favorites are Career Bliss. There's a website called U-Turn, The Savvy Intern with Mark Babbitt. And by following some of these folks on Twitter, I learn a lot about things that we're talking about right now, and students could as well. Additionally, let's say a student wants to go to work for, in Newport News, maybe Ferguson Enterprises or Genworth Financial. up in Richmond. If those companies have a Twitter account, by following that account, by retweeting or replying to their tweets, you quickly as a student become someone that they notice. And those people that are managing those accounts absolutely notice and keep track of who's responding, what's getting retweeted. So it can be a very powerful way for students to engage with prospective employers. Employers are also starting to use Instagram, Pinterest. I know some people think Pinterest is just kind of a female kind of thing, but you could actually pin a resume, you could pin something that you've written, some of your work. Pinterest can be almost a portfolio. And one of the trends I was reading about recently is becoming more visual. That with Instagram and Pinterest in particular, there's a visual quality there that is different than LinkedIn, Twitter, those kinds of things. I am not actually as familiar with Google+, but I'm starting to learn that. But I have read that, yes, get on it.
Okay. Well, I learned something new. I'd never heard of Pinterest before, so this is something I'll explore afterwards. I spend a lot of time in face-to-face meetings, and I think it's important. And I see that going on now with FaceTime and on their smartphones. But often people are in a public environment when they're talking, and of course you've got traffic and noise or whatever. And I find it somewhat distracting. And if a student's being interviewed by Skype, for example, should he or she make sure they're in a closed room, or what would you recommend in that instance?
Absolutely. There are several things that we encourage students to do. First of all, we encourage students to dress for the interview as if they were going to be face-to-face rather than being in their jammies for a Skype interview. Well, obviously not for a Skype interview, but for a phone interview. It helps you feel more professional if you're dressed professionally. Additionally, making sure that the background, if it is a Skype interview, is professional and is closed and quiet. So the crazy roommate is not running by, or your cat is not running by, but that it's closed, it's quiet. If you are on a cell phone, making sure that you've got a great connection, even asking, can everybody hear me okay? Understanding that adrenaline can cause us to speak more quickly than we normally would. And if you're on a cell phone or if you're in a Skype interview, making sure that as a student you slow it down a little bit, articulate your words clearly, just in case there are people who are not hearing as well as you think they should be. Just making sure that everybody can hear you clearly. And treating it as a face-to-face professional interview, and again, practicing, particularly a phone interview. We're so used to looking at somebody and smiling and nodding, and when you don't have that in a phone interview, it can be a little disconcerting. So it's well worth practicing.
Well, when you say practicing a phone interview, because I know a lot of the screening interviews we do here are first by phone, how do you practice for something like that?
Well, I would go so far as to ask a friend or a parent or a career advisor from your university if you could do a mock interview and ask them to call you and ask you a few questions. We encourage students to actually write out some of their responses to typical questions. Tell me about yourself. Tell me why you think you'd be a good fit for our organizations. And not that you want to sound robotic or rehearsed, but you want to sound thoughtful. You don't want to say, well, you want to have a smooth flow, and by running through it a couple of times and having a friend say, that sounded not quite right, or a parent or a career counselor. It just helps you. You want every little opportunity to stand out in a positive way.
Sure. What is the single largest challenge that most students entering the workforce today and going after that first interview, that first job, what are they faced with when this is a new era? I mean, it's changing faster than a lot of us can keep up with.
What I would say, what I see, is many students would call a job search applying to online job postings, and that's their job search. And I tell students, you should probably then also go buy a lottery ticket, because that's about the odds of getting an interview with an online job application. Somebody does win the lottery, but the odds are not in your favor. And so for many students, figuring out what are some other ways to engage with employers, to get known by prospective employers or people who work for the employers that you're interested in. And that requires more than applying to an online job posting. That requires, for example, using LinkedIn to find CNU alumni who are working for that organization that you're interested in, and then reaching out to them and saying, hi, I'm ClaireJacobs. Could I ask you just a few questions about the work that you do for that organization? And recognizing that the job search, career search process involves more than just applying to an online job posting.
So networking in the old-fashioned sense, I guess, is still very, very important.
Yes. I don't always call it networking because I think sometimes students regard it as that is kind of a schmoozy, I'm just trying to get something from somebody. It's not what you know, it's who you know. I talk more in terms of building relationships with people and asking for information and sharing information. I tell students, you are a very important demographic. That 18 to 24-year-old, people love to know, what are you thinking? How do you process information? How do you make buying decisions? And so for students to think they have nothing to offer in an informational interview isn't true. So building relationships with people, particularly within one's own personal framework, or certainly the next best framework is the alumni from your organization. And if those alumni are present on, for example, a LinkedIn alumni group, you can pretty much know that they'd be more than happy to have an email exchange with you, a 15-minute phone conversation, ideally coffee for 30 minutes. Most people are very generous with their time and their advice.
Excellent. What do you advise a student who thinks his resume or GPA are the only things that should be considered when he applies for a job?
Well, it's much more than that. Now, your resume should reflect all that you are at that particular moment. And that includes activities that you're involved with on your campus community, things that you do off your campus, work experiences. You know, sometimes students say, well, I don't have any work experience. And it turns out they've worked at Chick-fil-A for 3 summers in a row. And I say, well, first of all, you've gotten some great customer service training, we know that. And second of all, it shows that you've got a work ethic and that you're dependable. If the same organization brings you back 3 summers in a row, whether it's lifeguarding or working at McDonald's or being a Starbucks barista, that says something about your work ethic. So your resume really should reflect all that you are and that you're proud of and that you've been a part of. Your GPA, I think, matters sometimes, not for everybody, but for some organizations it will be an initial filter. It may cause their online tracking system to filter you out if you're not a 3.0 or a 3.2 or a 3.5, which makes it all the more important to maybe build relationships with people in that organization who might be able to advocate on your behalf and explain the reason that you don't have a 3.0 is because you worked 30 hours a week and you were responsible for all of your college tuition. So you were working and going to school, and oh, by the way, you were a student athlete. There are typically, for many students, reasons why that GPA might not be as high as they would like it. That's important to be able to articulate that and explain that. And then I tell students, once in your lifetime, a GPA will matter, and after you've got that first job, nobody will ever care again, really, unless you go to grad school.
Right.
So.
Very, very true. Well, Claire, I want to thank you for sharing your insight and how social media can be used as a tool by students seeking jobs and employers who are screening candidates. I want to thank our viewers for joining us for today's program, which was produced at the Institute for Advanced Learning and Research in Danville, Virginia, in partnership with the Virginia Space Grant Consortium. Please visit their websites to learn more about each of these organizations and the opportunities available through them. And Claire, thanks again so much.
Thank you.